Might we bow our heads a moment? O thou who art the maker of all things that exist, and the source of man's true wisdom, give us insight into this world that thou hast made, and sensitive spirits that we may use our knowledge wisely. May our insight into thy work in nature not make us proud. May our power over nature's forces not make us cruel. Bestow upon us that humility which is the mark of true greatness, and that dedication to truth and goodness which find their fulfillment in the welfare of mankind and the coming of thy kingdom. This we ask of thee, O God, in the name of him who is himself the way, the truth, and the life, even Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to welcome you one and all to this second of the Challenge to the Church series. 6 weeks ago tonight, we listened to the words of an eminent psychologist, Professor David McClelland of Harvard. He introduced us to the topic, religious overtones in psychoanalysis. We are to sit at the feet this evening of a great scientist, our fellow Princetonian, Dr. J. Robert Oppenheimer. He will introduce us to the world of nature and to the world of man insofar as nature and its forces have become an increasing prize to man and an increasing concern for man. No words of mine would add anything to the essential prestige or to your knowledge of our lecturer. Suffice it to say that he is one of our nation's, one of the world's greatest scientists, one whose name will be linked forever to the creation of the atomic era. Just for those who may not know the general outline of his background, he was born in New York, was for 11 years, professor of physics in the University of California. During 2 of these years, he directed the Los Alamos Scientific Laboratory in the far west, and has been for the last 11 years director of our sister institution, the Institute for Advanced Study. 2 things only I am going to say about Dr. Oppenheimer. One, I've hinted at already. In the history of science, his name will stand out preeminently as one of the creators of a great new era, the era which causes such exaltation and at the same time such dread and anxiety. That is the first thing. And the second, he has been a man greatly wronged by American officialdom, wronged by the mood of one of the most sinister periods in our country's history, but a man who has been able to transcend and overcome all meanness, who remains a man and a gentleman, and continues on the road of dedication to his chosen pursuit, the pursuit of truth in the world of science, Dr. Oppenheimer.
Thank you. I want to thank you for the warm welcome, and Dr. Mackay for his warm and generous words. A few years ago, an institution of learning, not far from here, but not in Princeton, inaugurated a new president. He was not given to eloquence, and he made an inaugural address which was not very distinguished, but in it there was a passage which struck the hearers as rather moving and appropriate. That unfailing arbiter of our morality, the New Yorker, not long afterward ran the relevant section of the address along with an address that had been given a few years earlier, also by the president of an institution of higher learning, also in this neighborhood, also not in Princeton. And the two were remarkably the same. Only a few cunning changes of word had been made. Whereupon the earlier speaker received from the later speaker a telegram saying, "It seems that we are both in trouble." I think, notwithstanding Socrates and notwithstanding Erasmus, if you, whose primary concern is salvation, and I, whose primary concern is acquiring new knowledge and at least transmitting old, are talking to each other, it is because we are both in trouble. I think one sees many signs of this. I think it is not an accident that the late Pope Pius spoke and wrote on many occasions of the most recent findings, primarily in physics and astronomy. I think it is not an accident that my associates have talked with an almost evangelical tone as they called on their colleagues and on all men who would listen to put an end to those institutions which they themselves had helped make insupportable to war and the things that make for it. I don't think the troubles lie primarily, the troubles that bring us together, lie primarily in science itself, defined broadly as to scope, but reasonably narrowly as to its intention, which is to learn and order, to find out new things and to find the order of things, rerum cognoscere causas, in a primitive phraseology which cannot be improved on. I think if I were talking to professional scientists or listening to them, we would have a great deal to say about the threats to the vigor and the beauty of science. But I have also to report that these threats at present have in many parts of the world, and here at home and in Europe, not impeded the most striking and wonderful advances and the most cordial welcome of these advances by those who are capable of appreciating them. The troubles that bring us together have perhaps rather to do with the fact that the very development of scientific knowledge has had consequences, has changed the world in a way which could not have been fully anticipated, for which we, as a group of men and women, have never been fully prepared, and which present us with questions and with difficulties, for which we look in vain to our tradition for an answer. I do not mean that the tradition is useless, but I mean that it is on these things silent. Now, I'm not tonight, first of all, I'm not going to cover the waterfront, because an hour is not only not enough to introduce you to the marvels of science, which Dr. Mackay promised, it is not even enough to tell you about the trouble science has brought. I'm going only to talk about a few points, and they are not perhaps the ones that come first to your mind. With these, I am also not going to try to give a prescription, though at the end I will get provincial and tell you what a physicist who has lived through the years of my youth, what special points he is likely to bring to bear on these troubles, or at least how it seems to me. I'm not going to give a prescription, but really to do what I can to help myself, and I hope you, understand a little better what the situation is, to face up to it. And perhaps that is the first step. One can tell a little bit about it if one thinks back to the time 170 years ago when this country was being created, being founded, and to the Enlightenment generally, and to the liberal hope which animated such a large proportion of the great men of the 18th century. I need not remind you that they were aware and spoke of the contribution of an increased understanding of nature and a growing understanding of man to the material civility of society. I need not remind you that they prized as sensitive, gentle, and cultivated people of wide interests, human curiosity, and our desire to understand things as good in themselves and requiring no complex justification in terms of other ends. But they certainly had in mind also that there would be beneficial effects of increased knowledge and understanding in the functioning of man as a man. The repeated references to doing away with superstition, the repeated references to the horrors of past error past illusion. They thought, for one thing, and this has certainly turned out to be true, that with increasing skill and increasing knowledge, and one need not be too sticky about the distinction between them, men would have wider choices. They would be more in command of what they did and did not do, and so would be more fully human. They thought that with a better understanding of the connection of things, men would have a more informed basis for making their choices, that their decisions would be based on a better knowledge of the consequences of what they did or opted. And they thought that man would have, and this equivocation is one I will have to come back to, a far more pervasive and ennobling understanding of the elements of necessity and of order in the natural world. They would understand the reason for things. Now, in vast measure, all of this has been true, and true really beyond anything that could have been expected 200 or 100 years ago. I don't want to even stress the material side of it, except insofar as it is relevant to some of the problems to which I will return. But knowledge of nature, and to a very small extent of man as man, and to a very large extent as man as animal, coupled with an always available human cupidity, with a reasonable amount of human labor, occasionally with a certain amount of public spirit, rather more frequently than one might expect, and with luck, has certainly altered the kind of material world we live in, and has in fact made a lot of choices available which couldn't have been available 100 years ago, many of them of a trivial kind, as to the choices of food or clothing, many of them a little less trivial, as to the choices of work or habitation. In fact, one could almost say that the multiplication of wealth has paralleled in some way the multiplication of knowledge, and that there is a kind of strange parallel between the progress of knowledge, which has been very great indeed, and progress in, well, let us say the national wealth or the world's wealth, measured in any way that you want. But these high hopes for the relation of man himself to his knowledge and his environment have, I think, not been nearly as well fulfilled. And from everyone you hear that the progress in knowledge has not been matched by a progress in wisdom, by a progress in humanity, by a progress in virtue. I am not sure that it is possible to progress in virtue. I am not sure that the supreme examples of that do not lie in the past. But there is in any case a sense of disharmony and unbalance between those things which have followed a curve, and the two curves are not the same, but it's not a terribly important point, a rapidly rising curve, the amount we know and the amount we have. There's been a mismatch between those things and any sense that we are up to it. I want to mention 4 points at which it seems to me things have gone wrong in the sphere of the human understanding. I'm not going to talk at length Well, I hope I won't talk at length, but I will not talk in detail except about two of them. One is that everything has gotten enormously bigger. This is partly, of course, because there are more people. It is partly because the units of human activity have gotten bigger. It is partly because of the pervasive, almost instantaneous nature of something that one could call communication. It is not, in all senses, properly called communication. When we just observe ourselves, we notice that our ability to deal with people is one thing when there are very few, and that it rapidly changes when we have larger groups. And this can be studied and has been studied. And as soon as you go beyond a very small number of people, you no longer have the sense of their integrity as a person, and instead you are forced to create a kind of abstract stereotype, a party, a position, a leader, just in order to be able to cope with it. You can imagine what that amounts to in a world with 2.5 billion people. As a almost inevitable consequence of this, but also as a peculiarity of the way we run our affairs. The notion of choice, never a simple one, the notion of deciding something, which is really one of the basic traits of being a man, and perhaps that function where one is most concerned with his integrity. This whole area of responsibility has become extremely befogged and clouded. We talk to each other about our responsibilities and our duties, and in simple situations, the family, parts of the community, we recognize them, we try to live up to them. But our duty to the larger units, to mankind and so on, these are indeed very foggy notions. And I think much of the anguish talk about how we are to live in the new situation, how we are to avoid the dangers and reap the benefits, how we are to retain a kind of kindness and not all kill each other. Much of the futile, rasping, horrid quality of this talk is because no one really has any sense of what does devolve on him, what he can as a person do. There is a frightful disproportion between our willingness to undertake a true or a secular martyrdom and our ability to find any way at all in which to do it. Simone Weil wrote, and this was 20 years ago, that in comparison and contrast to all the earlier generations, hers was marked by the paucity of true responsibilities and the proliferation of imaginary ones. She went on to say, this circumstance, once fully appreciated, conduces to a marvelous serenity of the spirit. But then she was not interested. That is not right to say. She despaired of social betterment. She was interested, and she died of this interest. The third of the things that has not gone right, and which interferes in a cruel and, to me, heartbreaking way, both with the ability of men to understand the elements of necessity and order in the world about them, and in a way which is not so necessary, but which is still quite troublesome, with the wisdom with which they can make decisions and choices, has to do with the almost total collapse of valid communication. This is a subject I want to talk about. And the other thing, which I will talk about a little, though perhaps in a more personal way, is that the old theme, the eternal theme of the harmonization of the necessary, that is, that which follows from the laws of nature, that which cannot be otherwise, and the good, that between necessity and freedom, that between efficient cause and purpose or final cause. This joint has suffered from the accretion of a terrible lot of calcareous matter. This joint is inflamed and in bad shape. And to this has to be added that in this matter, I use a word that bothers me a lot, but I use it because I think it is something we all understand. In this matter of values, that is, of the act of cherishing, dedicating, and committing, there is an enormous role played by tradition, and that, if nothing else, the world we live in is a world in which change is so great that tradition is emptied of much of its content. Emptied not because the tradition is not solid, but emptied because, as I said earlier, it has nothing in it to correspond to the questions, the problems, and the realities which erupt, partly because we know more, partly because we do more, partly because we act differently. Well, of these last two, I will say, to these last two, I will devote this talk. They are not the only important ones. I think the problem of what happens to societies when they become effectively large, what happens to societies when there is a dilution and a diffusion of responsibility, are of the utmost gravity. But you have a whole series of lectures, and I hope that some of your other lecturers will have a sense of competence to talk about these things. I don't. I don't have much sense of competence about any of them, but I have some very serious and sober worries about the problems of communication. I don't think here either that the world is such that one can solve the problems that I am going to talk about. I don't think here either that one will go back to a situation in which communication was a better thing or served other purposes. But I think that it's important to know and important to bring to the real world an attitude which does it justice. And I want to mention 4 separate aspects of the growth of knowledge, well, of the nature of knowledge, which seem to me to contribute to the difficulty, or to define it. The first is a brutal semi-quantitative thing. And it has to do with the very success of the scientific enterprise. Include in this as much of the study of man and his records as you will. I mean it very broadly. Include in it the study, the design, the work on instruments whose purpose is to get further information. Take it as broadly as you want. The Growth of knowledge can, of course, only be measured. The sum of human knowledge can only be measured in rather unsatisfactory ways. It doesn't refer at all to the quality of the individual work, whether that be measured in terms of what it must have taken in the greatness of the author, of the composer, or what it will mean in bringing insight and order to the life of those who read in later years. I don't think that one can talk about the sum of human knowledge in terms in which the Oedipus or the Gospel of St. Matthew play any relevant part. So I'm using it really in the sense that ordinary people would ordinarily use what people have found out about the world, including, when they can, it's not very much, our human part in it. Found out about it in a way which they can tell each other, found out about it in a way which, with enough trouble, can be verified and established as reasonably right or altogether wrong, found out about it in a way which causes them to write papers about it and fill journals about it and make books about it. Well, you can measure this either by volume of publication or by the number of qualified and trained people who are working at it. Neither measurement is entirely happy-making, but it is really so that no professional man will allow the accumulated publication in his field to hold trivial matter. It's hard enough without that. And the volume of publication is a good measure, not of the depth or beauty of new knowledge, but of its bulk. And the number of people, well, of course, today not everybody is likely to be as smart as the people who were working, let's say, at astronomy 200 years ago. On the other hand, they have enormous advantages in a much more effective collaboration and enormously better instruments and enormously better methods of analysis. I mean by better, not more beautiful for the time, but benefiting from all that has come before. And it is this cumulative quality to knowledge, this quality that everything you learn, if it's any good, is not only the end of a trail, but the beginning of a new trail. Everything you learn is not only an end in itself, but an instrument for acquiring new knowledge that has given rise to this elementary, extraordinary, and terrible fact that our knowledge has doubled practically every 10 or so years for a long, long time, for about 2 centuries. One can talk about the future, and it is important to bear in mind that this rate of increase can probably not be maintained very long, for the obvious reason that not everybody can be engaged primarily in getting new knowledge, and some people have to do other things. But it does mean that the world we have lived in the last years is probably going to get worse. It's not going to get better, from the point of view of the rate at which new things are found out and partially ordered and understood. This alone means that not only is the furniture in our house changing from generation to generation, and in less than a generation, but the means by which we could hope to understand it are changing. And it means that schooling can never really hope to keep up with any reasonable proportion of the sum of human knowledge. It means that we who are not any longer in youth will be very lucky indeed to know in 1 or 2 fields what is really known, what has been found out. Many will not know that. Most people won't. Most people will be terribly out of touch with human knowledge at its growing tip. Now, there are many illusions on this subject. And I think we foster them in our schooling. They are, among others, the illusion that the elementary truths that were found first in the history of the sciences are in a certain sense, the basic ones, the ones which encompass what came later. And that therefore it is enough to have a brief synoptic schooling in some of the branches of science, and then one will have a sense of what it's all about, and the rest is technical detail. This is not so. In the first place, it's not so on the practical side, which I regard as very, very unimportant. That is, the things which turn out to be decisive in the management of human affairs are not likely to be things that one learned about in school. They are likely to come from rather recent findings in science. But I don't think that that's a major point. The fact that we're burning so much organic matter, that the polar ice cap is going to melt much faster than it otherwise would, and that New York will be underwater, this is an elementary kind of thing to explain. If it's true at all, it can be explained. It may not be true at all. It's not hard to understand. The fact that there are dangers in blowing up 100,000 large bombs is true and can be explained and should be explained. And you don't have to go to any kind of school to learn the difficult ideas that are involved in that. That's not what I have in mind. The point is that as one goes on in scientific things, it is precisely the basic things that get changed. It is precisely the basic things from which you could, in fact, deduce a great deal else, which do have this organizing power, which are primary, from which something follows, which are the origin or the formulation of necessity. It is precisely in these that great changes take place. And these are the last that we can explain to each other. These are the last things that it is easy to tell a layman or another specialist about. So that the loss is precisely in that great field of understanding of necessity and order. The structure of the sciences is that they come from a common matrix. It is also that they have a wonderful freedom from contradiction. It is also so that they have a quality that you can never be confident that any part of any of them is irrelevant to any other. They have a potential relevance, but they are not in any way reducible one to the other. They are not in any way deducible from any first principles, and certainly not from any first principles which can be made generally a part of our culture. And so it is that although the process of ordering, that means of recognizing the particular in the more general, although this process goes on at a great rate and simplifies instruction in science and simplifies its understanding and makes it possible for people with only a finite number of years in school actually to get to the point where they can find something new, it does not keep up with the ever-branching, growing novelty of the subject. This means that all of this growth and wonder is almost unavailable to man in general, and that it is typically available in small, specialized parts to rather small, specialized groups, groups which, it is true, stretch from land to land, groups which feel across the physical frontiers and across the barriers of political and doctrinal hostility the greatest gratitude and welcoming each of what the other does. But still, small groups in marginal communication with each other and in marginal communication with us, with man at large. These are two great imbalances to which I would like to add a third and perhaps a fourth argument. The third argument has to do with an old truth that has been newly refined and illustrated, both in studies of perception and thinking and in the experience of atomic physics. It is in a certain sense trivial, but not so trivial. It is that there is an element of action in any intellectual activity, even so marginal a one as perception. There's an element of action which means that no perception is possible which does not leave out, which does not lose all record of a great deal that was going on. This, I think, wise men have always known. We have always known that our tradition and our history made us, made what we could understand and could see, blinded us to some things. We have always known that whatever else they do, and it's a great deal, the arts help to enable us to see what without them we would be blind to, and to see in common, not just as a private vision. In a certain sense, this is trivial, but it is not so trivial. I don't know whether to tell you a story that I like. It's a story of one experiment, one set of experiments that Rostand did in Paris. Has to do with nothing more elevated than a dog and nothing more important than the signals sent along the acoustic nerve from the ear to the acoustic cortex. And what it is this. If you repeat a certain sound, a bell ringing, I think it usually is, you see, if you measure the currents coming along the main fibers of this nerve, you see a pattern, and this pattern is reproduced and tells you that there is some connection between the bell that rang, what happened in the ear, and what will go on in the dog's cortex. But if you put a piece of meat in front of his nose and ring the same bell, there is no signal there at all. This is only to go one step further back. Not even in the sense organs. There is a kind of organization, pre-organization of what it is that you will learn, of what it is that you will notice, of what it is that will be part of the structure of knowledge. This, of course, I like, partly because we have listened to these learned folk, mostly in England, talk about the primitive thing, the primary thing on which all certainty was to be based, and that is a sense datum. And when you look at it, you see that it's a most elaborate and subtle and beautiful artifact and not primitive at all. But I like it also because it illustrates in a kind of pre-cognitive way that the cost of knowledge is a great deal of ignorance. The cost of perception is a great deal of imperceptiveness. That in this whole field, one has to adopt the view that the potential is infinitely larger than the real. One has to adopt the view that without tradition we would know nothing, but with tradition we have also lost a great deal of our knowledge, of our possible knowledge. This sense of the infinity of what there is to know, of the partially accidental quality, or rather let me say historical quality, it may be a wiser word, of what we do in fact know. This is the third thing which takes apart the common understanding based on effective communication between people about common experiences in terms which are defined by those common experiences. The fourth is related to this, and that is that I believe it is a very accidental thing too, and again I would say it must be studied by historians and not by logicians, as to what effect, if any, developments in science have on human life. Now, I mean that not primarily in terms of the mechanical differences, although here too it seems to me that there have been some mighty odd accidents. Things could have been done with scientific knowledge which lay fallow for a long time because they didn't have any great sex appeal for the economy or the industry of the time. And things get done in a great hurry, like making atomic bombs almost before you knew how, because they do have a great sex appeal. And a good deal could be written about the randomness and lack of logic in the relation between what we learn how to do and what we in fact do. But that's not what I meant. I meant that as really great discoveries are made in science, they may or they may not find in the ideas of the age a real resonance. They may or they may not affect the way people think about the problems of their own life, about what is in the vulgar sense called their philosophy, how they look at problems. I think those who have studied the history of science tend to agree that picking up an idea that has been found in the specialized sciences and seeing in it some clue to the meaning of life or the attitude toward truth or the way to conduct oneself, that this is something that cannot by any means be counted on. It sometimes happens and it sometimes doesn't. It tends to happen primarily when the discovery, though important, is rather primitive, so that it can be formulated in terms of unspecialized experience. It tends to be very unsatisfactory when the discovery, like relativity, is rather far along in a science, so that you cannot even tell an ordinary man what it's really about without making him really sit down and listen for several years, at least for several months. But it depends not only on that, it depends on whether the word that is used to mark the discovery happens to excite a mood or a sentiment or a hope in the community, in the people who are thinking in the community at that time. So you find the Enlightenment very much more excited by Newtonianism than Newton ever was. Newton could not have adopted the views which his discoveries were supposed to support. And today, there are relatively few things that are found out about the world of nature which are properly understood and which affect man's view of the world or of his place in it or of the way he should conduct himself. These 4 points, and there may be others, mean that we face a wholly new problem in living with one another. I will say a word or two about how I myself have come to look at it at the very end, but it must be obvious that if my description is in any sense faithful, and it's exaggerated because I've left out the mediation of textbooks. I've left out the mediation of popular journals and all the rest of it. But I have done this deliberately, thinking that this mediation does not solve the problem. If it is in any way a true description, then the consequences for our ideas of education, our ideas of a community, and many of our political ideas are indeed not trivial. Now, I think I will say a few words about a more provincial subject, almost in contradiction to what I have just said. And that is something of what the atomic physics of the early years of this century has predisposed those who lived through it to look for, what view it has given them. Because this is relevant to my own view of the question of the necessary and the good. It is relevant to my own view of the relation, well, of the tangled and, I believe, usually very poorly discussed subject of the relation between science and good, or science and value. There are a lot of trivial things to be said, which show, if nothing else, that the phrase, the ethical neutrality of science, must be a fairly empty one. As an occupation, it itself is based on a very clear belief that it is good to know, and that general knowledge, which encompasses particular knowledge, is better than particular knowledge. There are affirmatives and affirmations of value at the very beginning and in every exercise of the scientific life. And it is equally true that both by changes in institutions and by changes in knowledge, almost every ethical question of any complexity that man has ever faced has been altered by the development of science. I even believe that the question of one's attitude toward war, which is dealt with in so deep and apparently conclusive a way in the Bhagavad Gita, would not today be dealt with in the same way by the descendants of the authors of the Bhagavad Gita. And certainly it is impossible not to learn a great deal that is quasi-evaluative from science, in the very sense that Socrates and Plato used it. You learn that things are good conductors, people are good conversationalists, but only because you have a prior good already defined. It comes out in the end, for all that you say, that the good is neither in conflict, nor excluded from, nor disconnected from science. They intersect, they are involved with one another. But the good is complementary to science. And now I have used the word which makes me go for a moment into the experience of atomic physicists. This is not the experience of having lived through the last 15 lurid years, but a much earlier one, a purely intellectual one, a purely cognitive one. It was the discovery of the laws of atomic physics and an understanding of what they mean. It is a theme, an experience that has been talked about also here in Princeton very often by Niels Bohr. I think he has written best about it. I have talked and written about it for wider audiences, I think with a total lack of success, but I can't entirely help telling you about it. In trying to to understand not what a nucleus is or any such novel trash as that, but just what makes the properties of the atoms of chemistry and the normal physics of human life, where we don't break up nuclei all the time, but we do look at color and experience hardness and so on, came upon the fact that the notion of force, as we learned it from Newton, and of potential energy, were applicable to a very considerable extent in these problems, as they are not applicable in the contemporary problems of the constitution of matter. But that the notion of motion and of laws of motion, as we learned them from Newtonian mechanics, or of wave motion, as one learned in the case of light and other things, that these things were not at all simply applicable to the atomic domain. And when it got finally unscrambled, it turned out that although all earlier physical experience had some relevance to the description of atomic systems, it couldn't all be used at once, but more or less, speaking in a very qualitative way, half of it could be used at once. The most famous example is the description of things as being somewhere and sometime, a space-time account of them, saying where they are when. This is a perfectly useful and valid way to talk about some atomic phenomena, but not all. There are important experimental situations in which the where and when cannot be talked about without logical contradiction. Talking about the great laws of conservation, of energy and momentum, impulse. These also are laws which can often be applied, but not always, and never when you can say where and when. That is, never with any kind of precision, never on an atomic scale. And this situation, that we had an apparatus of conceptual machinery talking about nature, and that parts of it, that all of it was useful, but parts of it were useful only in situations in which other parts had to be excluded. This was called by Bohr complementarity. He has made a great deal of it, and I think all of us who have lived through this have. Let me give you one example. In the old days, especially, let us say, in the height of Newtonian mechanism, there were different orders of nature with an almost vertiginous difficulty about thinking how one might reconcile the order of the entirely mechanical and the order of the entirely purposeful. The conflict between efficient and final cause. A great breach, it seems to me, and it was really a breach, the importance of which was fully understood at the time, was made just by the great doctrine of the evolution of species, a doctrine which even today is not riveted firm. There are really quite open questions as to how one gets from here to there and what is involved in it. But at least it provided one element connecting the notion of fit or suitable or good for with some kind of machinery. This has been brought a great deal further by another arch, which is also not riveted closed, and which has to do with our confidence that living material can be created from dead, and that we know even the conditions under which this can be done and the conditions under which it probably did occur. It has been still further brought forward by another arch of a very different kind, in which it has been recognized that the gene is itself a physical, a material symbol. It has in it the information which will produce the baby or the flower. It stands for the baby or the flower, and it implants with the flower and with the matured baby the power to transmit this information, usually with a few uncorrected misprints, to the next generation. Well, in every one of these, you see, the closing of a great arch in which one realizes that there is no sharp separation between those phenomena that can be talked about in terms of efficient cause and those phenomena, like all of life, which should be talked about also in terms of purpose. You cannot describe an organism without saying what its organs are for. You can, but you find that you make a long speech without saying anything useful. One finds throughout the whole arch, from the furthest that we can see with our telescopes and the earliest that we can see and conjecture, to very close to the threshold of those concerns which are primarily yours, man and his freedom, that it is not entirely or primarily a difference in what is being talked about, whether one talks of it as necessary or as free, but primarily in terms of what one is talking about it for, primarily in terms of what kind of use one wants to make of the conversation. Well, this is one lesson which those of us who lived through these earlier years are not likely to forget. And it goes along with another lesson. We have seen very deep changes in what were thought to be almost unalterable ideas about space, time, causality, necessity, a good swatch of Kant's categories. We've seen that these changes came about not because the old ideas were wrong, but because they were adapted to man's common experience, the experience which we had all had together. And that as soon as the inventions of technology and the logic of mathematics are brought to bear on the world to look at something that's never been seen before, you may expect also some great surprises, not merely in what you find, but in what you can do in the way of talking about it. What ideas are valid and what ideas are full of an inherent contradiction. This notion that general ideas are likely to be limited to and rooted in experience and in tradition. This tendency to say, how did you learn that? What do you mean by it? This is certainly a second great consequence of living through this time. Because in the past, traditional ideas, for all the enormous sense of change that human history gives, have in these abstract matters not altered so often or so rapidly. They have. They did in the 16th century, in the 17th century. And I think we probably understand that they may have also in Hellenistic times. But we in this time have seen a tradition in one science remade before our eyes, and it gives us, toward tradition, a special blend of veneration because without it, nothing could have been done, and a little critical skepticism as to its necessity. We fit this in with the fact that knowledge can be true or false, but true knowledge is in the fact that we have true knowledge of this and not of that, is in a certain sense an accident. Now, I have tried sometimes to say how one can try to live with this, and there's a great deal more to say than I have given a basis for, and what I have talked about I can't properly polish off with any simple word. But it does seem to me that with the vastness of the intellectual scene, with the vastness of the human scene, unparalleled in man's history, with the lack of unique and engirding order, the existence of great deal of local order, with the nostalgia which this situation is bound to produce in anyone who faces it with honesty, with some appreciation of what tradition means and of its mutability and perishability. We have a kind of mixed, double, cross-purposes, obligation and duty. I think we have to cherish, build, and love our own tradition, our own work, what is close to us, what we can really live in. I think we have to have a kind of open, warm, welcoming interest and love for other people, for other people's work and their tradition and their cherishing. I think this is very hard. And really, if it were not that we could help one another, not least by appreciating how difficult it is, it would perhaps not be possible. I think it is a condition for being a man in this mid-20th century.
Dr. Oppenheimer has very graciously consented to wait on a while to answer questions. Now, this is a quite unusual opportunity for us to formulate our questions and our concerns and to listen to the answers of a master who, when he is involved in mystery, will admit it. Now, I'm going to insist, I feel I ought, that the questions be in writing. Those who feel moved to pose them can receive paper, if they don't have it, from the ushers. If you hold up your hand and don't have paper, you will get it. If you kindly bring up any questions that you may have, can I bring it up here? Because if you make the question from there, nobody will hear. And it's important for the others that, yes.
I once gave a lecture on physics, and at the end, either I or the chairman said that I would be glad to answer any questions. Someone said, would you please say it over again?
Yes. Where does the first come from? Or have all the questions been answered? Here comes a question, theological in nature for a scientist. What is your concept of God? Scientist.
I do not use the word. It seems to me the most ambiguous word I know.
The second question, is our predicament due to the fact that with an unlimited universe, we demand unlimited freedom?
Mine isn't. I don't understand this. Does anyone know whether the universe is or isn't limited? Would anyone really be able to make a case for this? I think it's a very open question, and it seems to me quite irrelevant to the human predicament. I know of no one who demands unlimited freedom. I think the most anyone demands, with a good conscience, is to know what he's doing, why. And I think this is hard enough. In what sense does the scientist depend on the laws of nature that you mentioned? Well, I'm afraid I don't fully understand. If the laws of nature were different, presumably there would be nothing like us. I don't know whether you mean, do we, for our existence as humans and people who get curious about things, depend on laws of nature? Of course we do. On much else beside. But, of course, you always use what you know in order to find out new things. You use it in order to build instruments. You use it in order to interpret your findings. You use it instrumentally in every way. And that is why you cannot just say to a young fellow, no matter how bright he is, no matter how gifted, and no matter how industrious, you can't say to him, now look, you find out the answer to the question, how many different particles are there in the world? Because the whole business of what is a particle, what we mean by such words, and how we go about doing it, is completely built on generation after generation, century of accumulated knowledge of the regularities of nature. I don't know who asked this question, and therefore I can't guess whether I answered it. A great deal has been written recently about the possibility of the integration of knowledge. Will you comment, as a scientist, on the possibility of such integration? Yes, I will. In fact, I have. Cross connections between one part of knowledge and another do exist and can be very fruitful. For instance, I think most of the laws of chemistry and much of its lore are translatable or from physics, derivable from physics in principle, but they are quite separate sciences. I don't believe that from the integration you will get very much, because if you take only what is common, let us say, to psychology, geophysics, and cosmology, just to take three sciences at random, it will be the principle of sufficient reason, and we are even not so sure that the principle of sufficient reason is true. That is, as you get more abstract, which is what I conceive it integration must mean, less and less follows from what you say. It may have a wider domain of applicability, but you can deduce very little from it. Integration takes place. It's taking place all the time, but it is local integration. I'm not trying to make a bad political joke. It is local integration between parts of one science and another, parts of the same science, integration by which one understands that two things are special cases of the same regularity, but integration in the sense that it would help rather than complicate the problem of learning, I think is less likely. I have another one. I'm behind schedule. Since the quest for knowledge is not restricted to any one nation, should not all new discoveries be disseminated throughout the world scientific community? Well, this is a question which the answer is obviously yes. On the other hand, if you are talking not of a new discovery, but of a piece of deadly hardware, you're talking of something outside the domain of science. And I think you can make arguments that we should tell our enemies how to make deadly hardware too, but they're arguments of a wholly different order from that we should tell them what we find out about nature and about life. And I hope that you meant the former. This is almost true, although there have been periods when it wasn't true. It is, as far as I know, almost true today, in spite of the deadliness of the political conflict. And it has not been true only to a very much more minor extent than people have believed if you refer to the truths of science, if you do not refer to technological gimmickry and the necessary design details. It's much more nearly in order than most people think. But here again, if you mean anything other than the discoveries of science, I think the question can be answered, but not within this framework, and I would have to know much more what you did mean. Did we understand you correctly in a statement which was, in essence, all ethics are subject to change as science changes? No, you didn't hear it, at least. I said that ethics was affected by science. Its content is affected by science. I mean this not in terms of precepts, but in terms of what the precepts mean. It is very clear that the concept "thou shalt not kill" has been complicated in recent years. Do you believe that knowledge can be accumulated indefinitely? Does there appear to be an end to final scientific theory? I think that it will continue indefinitely, but I think that this is, on the one hand, really a question of whether we will be able to think of new things to learn, and on the other hand, of whether we will be so organized as to wish to do it and be able to do it. As to the latter, the times in the past when there has been a real regression in intellectual activity, and scientific life is a large part of it today, have been very different than what seems likely today, barring really very grave disasters. I think it could happen if the much talked of Third Great War were to occur, and I think it could happen if an all-embracing and a fanatical political tyranny were to, a political tyranny with ideological or religious fanaticism were to get an absolute control of the world. These are pretty extreme things. As to the question whether living more or less as we do now, only more so, we will think of new things to find out, I'm fairly confident we will, and I'm fairly confident that the arguments for doing it will be the same curiosity, interest in understanding, and the self-promoting dynamism of knowledge, that once having settled one question, you're then in such a much better position to ask a lot more. I think this will go on, and at a rate which will be greater than we have witnessed yet, but perhaps not 100 times greater. What significance, if any, do you think that the Darwinian theory of evolution has for morality? I think I would answer that rather simply, none. I think those elements in morality that would be affected by the Darwinian theory were in trouble without it. Do you feel or believe that there is a mystical side to man's life and his relations to nature? Yes. It is impossible to doubt. I think it may be a little bit a question of words, whether you have in mind John of the Cross or just some rather unformulated sentiment. But I don't doubt either. I certainly don't doubt the latter, and I don't doubt John of the Cross at all. Do you feel that the present expanding universe can be related to an initial cause? I'm afraid I'm going to have to leave that to the late Pope Pius. The trouble with this one is that I can't make it out. If I could, I don't think I could answer it. Do you put the religious philosophies of the world's religions in the category of change and evolvement? Well, I would think that an historian would be more likely to answer that wisely than I, but it seems to me manifest that the answer is yes. In part, anyway, yes. And what part does your comment of lore play? I must be reading this wrong. In relation to the progress of science in recent discoveries of the nuclear age. Don't make that up. Our knowledge is limited, but we have to decide, and some decisions will be very definite. What has to be the measure for our decision? I think the decision should be virtuous. I don't think you can make a general statement any less thin and tautological than that. You're talking about all of human conduct. Most of it actually not categorized or covered by any rule, even if you were willing to accept a rule. I believe you mentioned life coming from dead material. What do you mean? Well, there is a very well-known Soviet-Russian biochemist called Oparin, and he conjectured quite a long time ago, before the last war, that if one had a reducing atmosphere, ammonia, methane, such as is generally believed to have existed on Earth in the early days, and if there were any kind of electrical disturbance, spark, or ultraviolet light, you would build up organic material. And this has been verified in the laboratories of this country, not in the sense that a living organism walked out of the experiment, but in the sense that very highly developed polypeptids were observed as precursors of proteins, and in some cases even proteins themselves. In other words, precisely the kind of object of which we know that if it's made right, it will survive, reproduce, and multiply. This is, I said, this was not a well-riveted piece of knowledge, and I don't want to leave you with the impression that I know for sure that this will come out, but I think it's important not that we know this, but that it's a kind of knowledge which we've begun to think of as possible. Will you comment on the freedom of communication among scientists in the U.S. government today? I am sorry, it's 5 years since I've known anything about it. Do you feel that the concepts of physics can be validly applied to the field of social work, i.e., the acausal world in quantum physics, something, the free will of man? No. I will not say that no concepts in physics will be without analogy in, well, what should we say, psychology. The analogies will probably be pretty bad, and it will probably be better, probably come out better, if the sciences learn their own vocabulary from their own experience. When something is starting, of course, it's new, and you can do no other than to borrow from a familiar experience in an attempt to describe it. That almost certainly will get you into difficulties as soon as you begin to find out what it's really like. As that goes on, your terminology has to be refined. Maybe you invent new words, maybe you redefine old ones. If you redefine old ones, you're in effect making the basis of a large number of bad puns. This has happened, and I have no doubt that in psychology some of the ideas of physics will occur, but indeterminacy in physics and free will in man are not related phenomena. Well, here are two difficult questions. One is what is truth, and the other is what is reality. I will answer the second question as I did the question about God. It is a word I do not use, and for much the same reason. It says, how does the scientist conclude that he has the truth? Well, I think the whole of science is a giant machine for finding out that you've made a mistake. And if the machine fails to find for you, the machine being all your colleagues, all other people working in the field, and their tight logical implications of one consequence from another. And if an ardent effort to prove that you are wrong doesn't work, then either what you said was more or less true, or it wasn't anything at all. And we think that we can tell the difference, because if it wasn't anything at all, nobody tried to prove it was wrong. Nothing happened. So it is, and I don't mean to be frivolous, but the point really is that science is not troubled by these questions, and that's one of its strengths. Whether one can learn from this, how other uses of the word true could be refined, is a much more difficult question. I mean, it's very difficult to say what one means by true in mathematics, and much less obvious. Is there a source of communication established to express feelings beyond natural matter and the experience of sense perceptions? Well, I would think most of our talk was not about natural matter or sense perceptions. Certainly most of the New York Times is not about either. I must miss the point. Is there a way of communicating about a supernatural experience? I think the experts say not very good. They say it's ineffable. I am not an expert. What is... Oh, we'll skip this one. In fact, we'll have one more.
Yes, sir. There's one more because the others have been asked.
Will you comment on what contribution, if any, Jesus Christ in his gospel may have to you or science? I really wouldn't know about science, because this is a matter of history which I am sure is very tangled. It is hard to imagine the history of Europe without Christ, and it's hard to imagine the history of science without Europe. As for myself, I would be the poor. I don't know whether I'd be a worse or better scientist, but that's not what you wanted to know.
We are deeply indebted to you, Dr. Oppenheimer, for what you have said, for the spirit in which you have said it, and for the great frankness with which you have affirmed that there were realms beyond your particular knowledge or specialty in the great frontiers of the universe. We have had what we have desired. We have wanted to be confronted by a great scientist, and to have no illusions regarding the realities of the scientific mind and the great natural order. And this experience, as other experiences which we may have here, will, I hope, give us a sense of realism in confronting every frontier in the world of our time. Dr. Oppenheimer has made a very decisive contribution to our thinking, our sensitivity, and our outlook. For that we are deeply indebted to him. Now, may I say that there is an exit by these doors, by these, of course, in that direction and in this direction too. Thank you.